The introduction of Eli Whitney's cotton gin brought slavery back in 1793. Before the cotton gin, slavery was slowly dying out. The explosion of cotton created an unending demand for labor, which was slaves in this case. Because of the use of slaves for cotton, this threatened the survival of the nation. With this, cotton became king. The increase in cotton led to an increase in money, which allowed Southerners to purchase more slaves and land, which led back to the increase in cotton. It was a vigorous cycle. Cotton drove the economic cycle for both the North and the South. The economic structure of the South became increasingly monopolistic. The bigger got bigger and the smaller got smaller. With the revival of slave labor came the revival of the Southern way of life. It was more of an oligarchy than a democracy, as the elite of the South were incredibly rich and represented the interests of the Southerners. The aristocracy of the South widened the gap between the rich and the poor. While the elite were known for having many slaves, the Southern way of life is better depicted through the fact that the smaller slave owners did not own a majority of the slaves, but they made up a majority of the masters. Even more so, there were many whites in the South with no slaves. All these whites without slaves had no direct economic stake in the preservation of slavery, yet they were among the stoutest defenders of the slave system. With the idea of social mobility and the chance to one day own slaves and be a part of the elite of the South, that was the American dream for the lower class whites. And the other reason is that even if they were poor and lower class, they had their racial superiority above the blacks. They could take perverse comfort from the knowledge that they outranked someone in status, the African American slaves. In 1860, the number of slaves had quadrupled as the booming cotton economy had created a seemingly unquenchable demand for slave labor. Upper South states like Virginia became the major source of supplies for the booming cotton economy of the Deep South. The planters regarded their slaves as investments in which they had sunk nearly $2 billion in by 1860. Slaves were the primary form of wealth. By 1860, the Deep South states like South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana each had a majority of the blacks that accounted for about half of all the slaves in the South. Slave auctions were a common and brutal sight. The open selling of human flesh under the hammer, sometimes alongside cattle and horses, was one of the most revolting aspects of slavery. With the rise of anti-slavery and abolition, pro-slavery whites responded by launching a massive defense of slavery as a positive good. Slavery, they claimed, was supported by the authority of the Bible and the wisdom of Aristotle. It was good for the Africans, who were lifted from the barbarianism of the jungle and clothed with the blessings of Christian civilization. In 1863, the sensitive Southerners created a gag resolution in order to preserve their way of life with no distractions. During the 1850s, the South was prospering. However, during the same time period, many slaves were able to escape using the Underground Railroad. In order for whites to protect their way of life, in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. The fleeing slaves could not testify in their own behalf, and they were denied a trial by jury. Regardless of the Fugitive Slave Act, the loss of slaves was infuriating. Although the loss of property is felt, the loss of honor is felt more, said a Southern senator. Threats and rumors of secession started in 1850. In order to preserve and expand their way of life, Southerners were in support for western and southward expansion. They wanted more and new slave territory. The slavery question continued to churn the cauldron of controversy throughout the 1850s, and in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe was published to the public. She awakened the North to the harsh realities of the Southern way of life. With the many attempts to destroy the Southern way of life, the violence from Bleeding Kansas from the states had slipped into the halls of Congress. The Sumner-Brooks clash and the ensuing reactions revealed how dangerously inflamed the passions were becoming between the North and the South. The election of 1860 just sealed the fate of the Union as South Carolina rejoiced over Lincoln's victory. They now had their excuse to secede. South Carolina seceded 4 days after Lincoln's election. In total, 11 states seceded, and these seceding states all followed South Carolina for reasons that trace back to slavery. In February 1861, the Confederate States of America was created, and at the beginning of the war, the Southern way of life seemed to have the most advantages. First of all, the South did not have to win the war in order to win its independence, and some of the advantages they had were military leaders, morale, and they believed cotton was an advantage at the time. However, the advantages of the North were much stronger. They had the economy and the sea. The North's vastly superior navy established a blockade that soon choked off Southern supplies and eventually shattered Southern morale. The lack of foreign intervention was one of the major factors that led to the South's downfall. King Cotton fell due to the surplus of cotton that foreign nations had. There was no need for more cotton. King Wheat and King Corn were monarchs of the northern agriculture, and they were not only more useful to both the North, but also foreign nations as well. The trade with England for corn and wheat led to the success of the North and the failure of the South. Because of the fall of King Cotton, the economy of the South was terrible. Their way of life was slowly falling apart. Serious inflation occurred. The Confederate paper dollar finally sank to the point where it was only worth 1.6 cents when Lee surrendered. Attempts to disrupt the Southern way of life included the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. And because of these radical changes, both sides knew that the war would be a fight to the finish. The Civil War ended in 1865 with the Southern way of life being demolished. Slavery was over, and African Americans were at last in a position to claim their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The nation was united politically but still divided spiritually by the passions of the war. Reconstruction. The destruction of the Civil War left thousands dead. Reconstruction was needed to heal the nation. A drastic change in the Southern way of life left aristocrats humbled. However, the economic lifeblood of the South, agriculture, was decimated. The slave labor systems, the fields, the crops, the livestock were all plundered by the Yankees. Cotton capitalism had lost out to industrial capitalism. The freed blacks were overwhelmingly unskilled, unlettered, without property or money, and with no knowledge of how to survive as free people. As a result, the Freedmen's Bureau was created in 1865. They provided clothing, food, medical care, and education. This caused major discomfort for white Southerners. In order to preserve the Southern way of life, black codes were passed in 1865 and in 1866 by Southern states. These laws were designed to regulate the affairs of the emancipated blacks, much as slave statutes had done in pre-Civil War days. These codes varied in severity across the states. These oppressive laws mocked the ideals of freedom. The black codes imposed terrible burdens on the blacks, who were struggling against mistreatment and poverty to make their way as free people. Despite the progressive attempts to change the South, racism was still deeply rooted in the white Southerners. Early 1866, one congressman quoted a Georgian, "The blacks eat, sleep, move, live only by the tolerance of the whites who hate them." Even with racism implemented in the laws of the North, it was still too different from their old way of life. In November 1865, the governor of South Carolina, James Lawrence Orr, insisted that emancipated slaves must be kept tied to the South's economic system by saying that in order for blacks to be civilized, they need to be put to work. As the South kept on trying to maintain their aristocratic society, the government persisted right back with innovative acts such as the Civil Rights Bill, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. As time went on, many people were coming down south. In fact, most who were coming down south were former Union soldiers and northern businessmen and professionals who wanted to play a role in modernizing the new South. Some Southern whites did not like the new radical changes and took extreme measures to make sure that the old Southern way of life was protected. And as a result, a group that formed was the Ku Klux Klan. Those who crossed their paths and continued their paths that destroyed the ideals of the Old South were flogged, mutilated, or even murdered. The political agenda of the KKK was the disenfranchisement of African Americans and their Republican allies, and the reinstatement of white supremacist rule. They tried to undermine the power the blacks had. The white South for many decades openly flouted the 14th and 15th Amendment. Many white Southerners regarded Reconstruction as a more grievous wound than the war itself. It left a festering scar that would take generations to heal. They resented the upending of their social and racial system, the political empowerment of blacks, and the insult of federal intervention in their local affairs. From the beginning of Part 3, it was clear that the South would not let go of their Southern way of life. It was the key to their large economic prosperity. As the Civil War raged on, the cracks in the Southern way of life widened until the aristocracy of the South fell. However, the effects of the aristocracy still remain today. The chance for renewal and reconstruction was given to the South, but the nostalgia and racism of the past clung onto the Southerners. This is incredibly important as it has shaped history and has shaped current events.